What possible national security implications are there, or aspects are there to the Jeffrey Epstein case, unless we're talking about relationships with domestic intelligence agencies or foreign intelligence agencies?
Well, right there, Glenn Greenwald asked the million-dollar question, one of the aspects of the Epstein Files case and story that's being totally ignored by the corporate media. Everyone wants to know who was on the list and who were clients, and those things are important, but what's being shoved under the rug is what really makes a difference in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the deep state. So Glenn Greenwald gets into the truth about the Epstein Files here. Let's watch and let's react.
Remember the Epstein Files? The Epstein Files, those are the things that Donald Trump spent 2024 promising to release, and those were the files that were supposedly released back in February when Pam Bondi invited a bunch of right-wing influencers to the White House and handing them big, flamboyant notebooks that said on them Epstein Files, and they were all smiling, thinking that they had an exclusive on all this good stuff that was for the first time going to be publicly revealed. And as it turned out, the whole thing was a sham. All these documents had been long ago made public in a whole variety of ways through various litigations and FOIA requests on the party media outlets. There was absolutely nothing new in any of them. And here is Pam Bondi talking about that on Fox News on February 21st, 2025, which is basically 2 full months ago now.
DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients? Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
So have you seen anything that you said, oh my gosh?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems like we were hoodwinked with this story, and what kind of gambit was that anyway on behalf of the Trump administration? If you really were going to release it in this form and just smack people over the head with information that had long been available, it really seems like this was played badly, even if the whole thing was a paper tiger. They never had files. They never had access to that information. It sure seems like some form of cover-up is underway, whether it's in the DOJ or the FBI. It's hard for me to say. At some point, it seemed like Bondi was mad at the FBI because she didn't receive as much information as she originally had expected to get from them. But the FBI deep state maintains power. It's siloed, and a lot of people within the FBI have held power for decades without regard to electoral outcomes. So we'll have to see what comes from that.
Now, the whole issue of the client list and the like, I understand why that gets people interested and excited. But the reality is that we've already seen so much evidence of the people with whom Jeffrey Epstein was cavorting. People just of the highest status and wealth throughout the world. It basically brought down Prince Andrew of the British royal family. We know Bill Clinton and Donald Trump both had extensive relationships, social relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which doesn't mean that they were on his island or having sex with underage girls. But we know all the people who have been associated with Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. There may be some client lists, although Pam Bondi says I haven't seen anything shocking so far. But to me, that's not really the most interesting question, just because of how much disclosure there's already been around who's been on those flights, who's been to the island. We pretty much know the answers to all of those questions.
So Glenn's right. There probably are more pressing questions and aspects to this story. But the one thing that still doesn't make sense to me is how does Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein get convicted for conducting a sex trafficking ring to no one, for selling underage girls to no one? How is that even possible that that happens? Well, the only reason that happens is there were clients that were high-ranking, well-connected in government or the corporate donor class or something like that. This would not fly in any other case where such high-level politicians weren't implicated. Otherwise, we would know who some of the clients were. I understand redactions for victims or, maybe even people associated with Epstein where there's no evidence that they participated in this sex ring. But just the very idea that they got convicted of sex trafficking to no one is crazy.
To me, the much more interesting question is the geopolitical one. Obviously, when you have the most powerful people on the planet being put into compromising positions on Jeffrey Epstein's island, on his plane, in his mansion in Palm Beach, in his mansion in the middle of Manhattan. And we know that there's all kinds of tapes and recordings that have been made that gives enormous amounts of blackmail power over these people. The questions of whether foreign governments, whether intelligence agencies in our country or others, in some way exploited that information, helped arrange it. There's always been a question of what was the real source of Jeffrey Epstein's massive wealth. We're talking here about a kind of wealth that is a multi-billionaire wealth.
Well, the official answer is he was the money manager for Les Wexner, who was, a billionaire tycoon, I believe in New York. And for whatever reason, after teaching math and essentially getting fired from a job teaching math, Epstein got a job managing this guy's money and inherited multi-million dollars from this guy, apparently because he loved him so much and, I guess whatever expertise he had in saving this guy money. I don't know if it was help investing or saving money in taxes or whatever, but Whitney Webb wrote a great book about this called One Nation Under Blackmail. And it's also the case that Jeffrey Epstein had a long-standing connection and friendship to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. And this is a very well-documented thing that Ehud Barak traveled and met with Jeffrey Epstein at his residence 30 times in the 2010s. So we know that he's had connections not only with these high-ranking politicians in America, but also with Israeli politicians. And his father-in-law, Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, was also well connected to the Israeli government. Seymour Hersh even thinks that he was connected to Mossad. And, Seymour Hersh is one of the most eminent journalists of the entire 20th century.
He wasn't just somebody who was extremely wealthy. There's zillions of people like those. There's all sorts of ways to become wealthy on that level. We're talking about somebody who had just the kind of wealth that only billionaires have. Constant flying jets, massive jets that were private, that he took everywhere. $80 to $100 million properties all over the world. The ability to purchase a private island, to donate massive sums of money to gain entrance into all sorts of... So where did that money come from? Nobody really has ever been able to answer that. We know a couple of things, including his relationship with somebody named Les Wexner, who himself is a multi-billionaire, with whom Jeffrey Epstein worked. But there's no real expertise, identifiable expertise that Jeffrey Epstein had. He never did anything on Wall Street that was particularly impressive. And the question has always been, was there some government, some intelligence agency behind him with whom he was working or for whom he was working to create essentially a honey trap?
That's the craziest factor in all this, is it seems like his expertise was not such that he could manage the money of such a wealthy mogul tycoon in this way and then get paid. I think it was something like $150 billion from Wexner for it. It doesn't withstand an earnest amount of scrutiny. It seems inconceivable if you were any other person outside of someone either connected to wealthy corporations or intelligence agencies or foreign or domestic governments.
That would give these intelligence agencies knowledge of and therefore power over what a lot of people were doing. That, to me, is the answer that we don't have any resolution on. Now, maybe the answer to that is no. But we really haven't had any sort of documentation providing guidance on that one way or the other. And we know for certain that these files are in the custody of the U.S. government, which has repeatedly promised to release them, pretended to release them back in February, although they didn't. And the question is, where are the answers to that questions?
I think a lot of us know the answer, and The Epstein files are on a broken FBI hard drive that's been splintered into 1,000 pieces and scattered to the winds. If they ever existed under the Trump administration to begin with. If they weren't already in that condition during the Biden administration. I think that's probably where they are.
And when will we get the answers to that question, if ever? And what we're being told right now is that the reason we can't have them is because there's a lot of redactions that need to take place for national security purposes. I understand that some of these files would need to be redacted before released. You don't want to release the names, for example, of victims who haven't been identified, who don't want to be identified, of some of the girls who were sex trafficked. That'll make sense. And perhaps you don't even want to release the names of the people who were Jeffrey Epstein associates, but where you have no evidence they engaged in any wrongdoing because that can harm their reputation. I understand that as well.
Yeah, I made those same points. That's exactly true. But to say that redactions are necessary for national security makes no sense. There are probably innocent parties in this whole thing that weren't aware of this going on. And, some redactions on a personal level might make sense, but they've spoken about and flirted with the fact that redactions have to happen for national security. What national security is being compromised? Well, I don't think you can say that unless he was connected to Mossad or the CIA or, any other number of different intelligence agencies throughout the world. It wouldn't make any sense other than to compromise the U.S. relationship with these countries.
But why would there be national security redactions unless Jeffrey Epstein had relationships with foreign governments? And if Jeffrey Epstein had a relationship with foreign governments, it seems like we could probably narrow down which are the most likely.
Spoiler, probably Israel. If so, all the evidence that exists, albeit circumstantial, points to Israel.
And then that leads me to the question of whether or not it's really possible that if those answers exist within the files of the U.S. government under the Trump administration, whether we will ever actually see those at all.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not sure it even exists in the FBI. I think it's very likely this stuff, or the material to the extent that it existed, has been destroyed. But that's a good question. I hope some of it comes to light, but it sure doesn't look good. It sure looks like the American people were hoodwinked by this, and that the Trump administration made a huge error, huge blunder by flirting with that this was going to be some kind of grand release that everyone wants to see. It's just completely backfired if they thought they could sell that without actually producing any goods of tangible value.
And at the very least, we ought to keep up the pressure. Here was the Department of Justice, the Public Affairs Division, on February 27th of this year, with the title, Attorney General Pam Bondi releases first phase of declassified Epstein Files. And that was when it turned out that they made a big fanfare out of, oh, look, we're fulfilling our promise, you're getting the Epstein Files. They invited these Twitter influencers to the White House. Here's Rogan O'Hanley. And they posted pictures of themselves. There they are. I think that's Chaya Ryak, too, the proprietor of Libs of TikTok.
Everyone remembers
out
this.
With their binders. The binders had Epstein Files. They showed them to the public. There you see, it's like the Epstein Files. Look, we got the Epstein Files. We're so happy. We're so smiley. We're celebrating. We're finally going to get the answers. Look, they're giving it to independent media. We're right outside the White House.
I'm sorry. Glenn's portrayal of this is freaking hilarious, man. Props, Glenn. That's hilarious how you describe it. That's exactly, what the memory was. And then everyone was just completely deflated, like a balloon that's lost all of its air after this.
And there you see the close-up, the Epstein Files, Phase 1. And it turned out these documents were an absolute joke. Not a single page that was in them that was previously unseen. Now, Trump has been asked about this on a couple of occasions, including on April 22nd, which was yesterday. He was in the Oval Office, and he was asked, hey, what about those Epstein Files? And here's what he said.
Epstein documents released, the rest of them.
Which documents?
The Epstein Files.
I don't know. I'll speak to the Attorney General about that. I really don't know.
Yeah, what's crazy is I actually might believe him. He actually might not know. This stuff may have been kept in, the closest monitored, silo in the FBI by people that were responsible for keeping it secretive and for keeping it from our elected officials, because the deep state wields power over elected officials. And that's not a new thing. That's happened for a long time. It's happened with both the FBI under Hoover and the CIA under Dulles. We know this is the case, and it's not limited to those two agencies either.
I know that we've done the RFK. The Kennedy, Martin Luther King is out there very shortly, so we'll find out. But we've really announced we're doing them in full transparency. When we did JFK, people were saying, "Oh, maybe it wasn't all; it was all."
He's absolutely right about that. There was a full disclosure of the JFK files. Now, there's still some files within the CIA and other places that haven't quite been released. But the documents they released, they did it in unredacted fashion.
And to be honest, I think that's probably either the best or the second best thing that Trump has done during this administration is that release. It was significant. It was much more than he did under his first term, and it revealed a lot of additional facts, mostly related to the CIA and people around the intelligence community that were remarking about these issues. And other than that, the dismantling of USAID was probably the other best thing that Trump did. So he gets props for that. But if you really want to make people believe, Trump, that you're an enemy of the deep state, the biggest way you can stick it to the deep state is to complain daily about how they are withholding this information, either at the FBI or the DOJ, or to get to the bottom of how this information is missing. He should be clamoring about that if he really wants to make people believe that. He should be talking about the crimes that the deep state committed by forcing Edward Snowden into exile, for Clapper lying on the stand about the existence of the surveillance state. All sorts of crimes, the Russiagate hoax. Thankfully, some more information in regard to that has been released too, but you really don't get the feeling that Trump is truly as big of an enemy of the deep state as he purported during his campaign, which is honestly a real shame.
And that's why I have those questions about the Epstein files. Why are all these redactions necessary for this, but not for the JFK files? And again, the things that concern me the most are when they start saying that the redactions are for national security purposes. What possible national security implications are there, or aspects are there to the Jeffrey Epstein case, unless we're talking about relationships with domestic intelligence agencies or foreign intelligence agencies? We do have some clues about some of the people, the extremely wealthy people who surrounded Jeffrey Epstein, who seem responsible in some way for his ability to have constructed this very powerful network of highly connected people and what their connections are.
Yeah, Glenn's exactly right. And some of those people I already named, Ehud Barak, obviously he had personal friendships with both Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. He had connections with Ehud Barak, Les Wexner, Robert Maxwell, and many others. So it's hard to understand how far this is kind of ingrained into the deep state, into the intelligence communities, and into the wealthy, landed, well-connected class. We might never know, and that's the most unfortunate thing in the world, because this is a child sex trafficking ring that involves some of the most powerful people in the world, and we may never get to the bottom of the answers. You kind of get a sense, as Glenn says here, and I think he's totally correct, that the client list and constant talk about the client list, as important as it is, I'm very interested in that, or who, procured these services, that might actually be a red herring for the more important factor, which is Epstein's connections to intelligence communities or possible government programs. And if there is a most likely one for him to be connected to, I think Whitney Webb makes a good case for it being Israel. But to be clear, she doesn't outright accuse him of being connected to Israel, but that is something that there is circumstantial evidence of, to be sure. Now, Seymour Hersh outright called Ghislaine Maxwell's father connected to Mossad or a Mossad agent or something of that sort. And people will call him a conspiracy nut, but again, he's one of the most prominent and accomplished journalists of the 20th century. He broke the My Lai massacre, the bombing campaign in Cambodia in the 70s when Nixon did that before ending the war in Vietnam. He covered the Abu Ghraib scandal in the 2000s, I think 2003 or 2004 on that one. He also most recently covered the fact that it was U.S. and CIA involvement in the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. He's consistently called a nut no matter how many times he gets it right. And he thought that about Maxwell. So there are circumstantial connections that would connect Epstein to Israel. But he also could be connected to the U.S. Intelligence Committee. We don't truly know, and we might never know. And that's one of the biggest crimes that's ever been committed that the American people won't know. For all the talk about transparency, it doesn't seem like Trump is as upset as he should be if he were a true enemy of the deep state. I'm glad about the releases he has made, and let's hope that the MLK files and some others will yield more information as well. He has been more transparent with some of that documentation than many of his predecessors. So even all this said, notwithstanding, he has done some good in that regard. But I do want to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think that Epstein was connected to any international intelligence agency or any government? If so, which one or which ones? Or what do you think about the Trump administration's strategy toward the Epstein files? Let me know in the comments below. Till next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.